Good afternoon, everybody. This is Eric Sweden with NASCIO, and this is another in our series of webinars on data management. We're building a curriculum in this whole subject area, and we are pulling in the best presenters on the globe, and one of them is David Marco. We're really happy to have David here. He is an absolute authority in metadata management. Highly recognized around the globe in the field of data management, data governance, business intelligence. And we are going to be discussing today metadata management, one of the key ingredients. And as we've stated in past webinars, we're anchoring all of our curriculum in the DAMA International Data Management Body of Knowledge. And we are encouraging states to do the same thing. So David, we are so glad you're here. We're going to turn it over to you right now.
Well, Eric, thank you so much, and I'm very glad to be talking with everyone today, and I'm looking forward to getting all the questions from you. Thank you for that kind introduction. We have a ton of information, so let us move forward. This first slide is just a background slide on EWS Solutions. We've done tons of work in this area. When you look at metadata management, it is something we have done for over 2 decades. This is just a background slide. On my profile, I included my email address. So if there are questions or if people want to get more detail on one of the topics that are brought up, feel free to send me an email. And with that, let us move forward and look at our agenda. This is the first. I think we're going to do a couple talks on metadata management. So in this one, I really wanted to make sure that we had a solid foundation. So we're going to look at the fundamentals of metadata management. We're going to talk about the 2 major types of metadata, business metadata and technical metadata. We're going to go through some metadata management use cases, look at metadata's ROI, or return on investment. And then we're going to look at metadata management and data management, and we're going to do all of this in the framework of what we are dealing with as state governments. Hopefully that sounds good. Hopefully everybody's on the right call. So let us move forward. Let's look at some basic fundamentals of metadata management. It's interesting. We hear all kinds of different definitions on metadata. The most classic one, the one we've probably read the most, is it's data about data. And I remember when I first started working in this field, and I read that definition, and I thought, okay, data about data. Well, what does my application look like, which does data about data? What does the SQL code look like? So when we get a definition of data about data, it doesn't really help us in understanding what is metadata management and how do we use it. And what is metadata? So let me give a little bit of a more complete definition. Metadata is a type of data that digitally describes the who, what, when, where, why, and how of an organization's data, its processes, its applications, its assets, its business concepts, and other things of interest. So again, metadata is just a type. So let's unpack this for just a moment. Metadata is a type of data. It's digital. It's something that we have in a database. And it describes the basics of our organization's data, the who, what, when, where, how, and why. And it does this not only for data, but our processes, our applications, other assets, business concepts, and just other things of interest within our organization. Hopefully that makes sense. Let us continue on this concept, because I like to think of metadata more simply as it's knowledge. It's everything that data isn't. Eric was so kind to give me an introduction. If I were to go up to Eric and say, Eric, here's some data for you, 27, 30, and 80. Let's make some decisions based on that data. Well, he would be stuck because I gave him data, clean data. But what I didn't do, or think of it as content, I gave him content. But what I didn't do, I didn't give him context, the metadata around that data. If I said, Eric, I'm going to give you sales figures in millions or billions for your agency, he can look and say, oh, sales are increasing or they're decreasing. He could actually use the information. And metadata provides the context to the content of our data. So let's look at that a little bit more. So metadata contains the knowledge about our data. Maybe that a field is called customer name. Maybe that it's 40 characters in length. It exists in systems A, B, and C. Maybe that organization has 3 systems which contain customer master data. All that is metadata. Anytime you're saying, hey, this system has our customer record, our universal global customer record, that's metadata. Data would be a specific instance of customer name, let's say equaling John Doe. So metadata is all this knowledge, all this stuff around the data, the who, what, when, where, how, and why. And the data is the specific instances. Now you see another bullet on this slide. It's called information. Information is data that is meaningful to a business user or an end user, meaning they understand it and they know exactly what they want to do. So let's kind of summarize this. Data, my example of what I gave to Eric earlier, 27, 30, 80, that's data, and it may be cleaned, it may be scrubbed, it may be of high quality, and that's content. But if he doesn't have any context, meaning metadata, the knowledge that those numbers refer to sales, refer to revenue for his agency for the last 3 years, if he doesn't have that context, then what he doesn't have is real information. For those of you who have a military background, we like to call it actionable information, meaning we get this information and we know exactly what we're supposed to do. We know we need to speak to our deputy immediately. I look at this number and I know I need to speak to our deputy. Or I look at this number and I know I don't need to. Or I look at this number and I know I better avoid the deputy today. So I get the information, I understand it, and I know exactly what I'm supposed to do. If anybody has a question, please don't hesitate to ask it, because this concept of metadata is seminal into understanding how you use it, manage it, and make it a strategic weapon that can help your agency. So let's move forward. Okay, let's look at the return on investment when we manage our metadata properly. So I think it's fascinating. We need a system that manages our metadata. Metadata exists throughout a state government. Every system we have, every piece of software generates metadata. The challenge is managing it. And we need to take this metadata, we need to integrate it, and we need to utilize it properly. And the application which does that is called a managed metadata environment. That's the term. So when we look at that, the key to our prosperity is how will we gather, retain, and disseminate knowledge. And really, a managed metadata environment is all about gathering our metadata, retaining it, and disseminating it. Because how can we be agile when we don't know the who, what, when, where, how, and why of our data? And this one always, to me, is just fundamental. We hear about things like machine learning and artificial intelligence and all these new cool technologies. The challenge we have with any of them is that if the data is wrong, if it is flawed, if we don't even know what we're pulling in, it won't deliver real results. And when you look at being more agile, being leaner, we need to know the basics of our data. Think about it. Agile is supposed to speed up our life cycles. That's the promise of it. I recall working with one agency in particular where their knowledge workers were spending over 80% of their time. Actually, it was their data science area, spending over 80% of their time just looking for the data that they wanted to use, as opposed to writing their complex algorithms, looking at the analytics, and using it to make decisions. So metadata management targets this area. So let's continue. So let's take a step back and understand how metadata is organized. There are two general types of metadata: business metadata and technical metadata. Technical metadata, or business metadata, provides a semantic layer between our IT systems and the people who utilize them, the business people, the people who are making decisions. Maybe it's your taxing department, maybe it's your roads, maybe it's your streets and sanitation, maybe it's education. It provides that semantic layer between those systems and our knowledge workers. Technical metadata is metadata designed for our IT department. It helps them better manage, maintain, and grow their IT systems. So if you didn't catch all that, don't worry. You won't even have to listen to the replay because I think we show them on some of the slides here. So business metadata, again, it provides a semantic layer between our systems, whether they're business intelligent or just our business intelligence or just our operational, and our end users. And why is business metadata valuable? It reduces our training costs. This is a big area because it is difficult when we add people into our organizations to get them up to speed. It makes strategic information that we have, whether it's in a data warehouse or a supply chain management application, much more valuable. Because again, it's about creating actionable information, limiting incorrect decisions, helping people find the information they need. And then just one last point on this slide. It's a must for data governance. I was asked today to really focus on metadata management, but here's one of the key items that I want to make sure everybody walks away with. Data governance is a critical concept in our industry today. Most of our state agencies are, in fact, building governance programs. Data governance defines the people processes of our organization. Metadata management is the key technical enabler of our data stewardship programs. Because if you think about what a data steward does, 80% of the time they are working with metadata. They're looking up valid taxpayer types. And let's say we have, the data steward is trying to figure out how many valid types of taxpayers do we have. They may define 7 of them, and the proper values are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. All of that is metadata. The 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, 1 being somebody who is below the taxable limit, so they are exempt from taxes. 2 maybe is a business. 3 maybe is a nonprofit, and so on and so forth. All of that information is metadata. And that's why good, sound metadata management, both from a process end to the technology end, is critical for data governance. So I will continue. Hopefully that begins us a little on business metadata. And let's look at it a little bit in action. So what we have here on the screen is a classic analytics type of report, and a very simple one at that. It's just showing global sales by month. And it just shows by month, by product category, U.S. sales dollars, and international. Very, very simple report. Wouldn't it be great if we could look at a column on this report, right-click, hit F1, hotkey, and get a business metadata definition for that column? And that's exactly what we're showing here. And what we see is sales dollars, U.S. sales dollars, is comprised of aggregated sales revenues from the United States, Canada, and Mexico, but it does not subtract sales dollars from returned orders. Well, here's an interesting challenge, right? How many of you would have known, how many of us would have known by looking at this report that U.S. sales dollars included Canada and Mexico? Most of us wouldn't. We would not think that at all. And some of you are saying, well, wait a minute. Is that a real-world kind of example? Absolutely it is. Most manufacturing companies count Canada and Mexico as part of U.S. sales dollars. And I'll tell you why. These organizations have very slim margins, typically 1 or 2%. So they are made and broken based on how well they ship. So they can get their product to Canada and Mexico on a truck. These same organizations tend to think of Hawaii and Puerto Rico as international. Why? Because you have to put your product on a plane or most likely a boat. So you can see how this type of business metadata is seminal to understanding a report. Because how many of us, when we looked at that field of U.S. sales dollars, would have known intuitively that Canada and Mexico were included? But then let's take it a step further. How many of us would have known that we didn't subtract sales dollars from returned orders, the second part of our definition? Well, we wouldn't. That's something we wouldn't know. And that is really significant. If I'm going to make business decisions about our agency based on U.S. sales dollars, I mean, that's just critical. And think about this. So hopefully this example is making sense to everyone. It's very important because I picked a very simple field called U.S. sales dollars. Imagine if I picked something like taxpayer liability, a zoning requirement, maybe a complex actuarial type of formula. You can see how the complexity of these columns can get much more severe than what I'm showing here. This is actually a highly simplified example. Because how do we get this information? Well, the way we get it today is we have to call a lot of people. And in our state agencies, this is a challenge. A lot of times, it's hard to reach those people. It's hard to even find out who they are, let alone get some of their time. So to have business metadata integrated right on our analytics is something that most companies, most organizations target doing because the return is so significant. Let me continue. Let's talk about metadata for making better decisions. So same report I showed before, same exact report. But now, instead of showing metadata just on a column, we're going to show it on a row, business metadata put at the row level. And here what we're showing is, and we're looking at television sales for the month of November. Wouldn't it be great if, again, we could right-click on that row or hit F1 or hotkey in some way and get business metadata on that row? And we would find that, 1.7% of the records were not loaded. For those of you, I would bet many of the folks on our call today work with analytics in their state agency. Well, one of the things that I'll share with you is for those who've ever built analytical applications. You know that a lot of times there's data that doesn't get loaded. It has an error. It has a problem. I can name you one large agency we worked with where they were building a massive analytical database in the terabytes of size. And it was interesting because as they were piping over the data to put into their warehouse, they were anticipating a very significant number of errors, close to 80%. So literally we were pulling all those errored records out and putting it into its own database. Funny title. They had come up with a name for that error database. They called it Purgatory. So definitely something that you got to appreciate humor like that. So that database was 4 times the size of the one that they were using for their analytical decision making. So really important. That's an extreme example of a high number of errors. But this type of information impacts the decisions that we make, because if I'm a decision maker for our organization, do I want to know the numbers I'm looking at are skewed by as much as 8.4%? No? I hope your answer is yes, because that could change the decision that you might make. And this is really important because, and we'll talk more about this as our talk continues, but we've done a lot of work at the federal level I've spent a lot of time in Washington, D.C., in Crystal City, for those of you who know that area. And there is a very significant trend in government today, and that is the centralization of more and more processes. At one time, states were considered much more autonomous, and what we see is the federal government pulling more and more decision-making up to their level, and this is impacting our states. One of the reasons that they are able to validate that is because the data they're getting from their states is inaccurate. It's flawed, and the states don't even realize that. I'll give you an example. We did a massive counterterrorism data warehouse for the FBI, and it's just a wonderful project. And one of the interesting things that had happened was we were getting data. So take a step back. Where does the FBI get their data from? Well, they get their data from local police agencies. Oh, well, that's at the state level. So they pull this data up. Well, we could tell these data files that were being sent from the states had some significant problems in them. And here's what we discovered. Well, when you capture somebody who is suspected of terrorism, not often do they give you their real name. You arrest this guy, and he's suspected of terrorism. You look at his ID, and it says, Michael Jordan. It has all kinds of cut lines in it from razor blades and all this kind of weird stuff. The guy's 5 feet tall. He's clearly not Michael Jordan. So anyway, the police officer knows this. So what we had discovered was there were some huge problems in the names of the terrorists that we were getting in the Hoover building in D.C. What we had discovered was when a police officer arrests somebody suspected of terrorism and they do not have a degree of confidence that they have his correct name, these agencies were putting the name of the arresting officer in the perp field in their police system. So back in D.C., in Washington, D.C., when we get these data files, we're seeing names of people who were born in the Sudan or Saudi Arabia with names like John O'Malley, Jim Gerbasi. I mean, these are clearly not folks born in those areas. And we would see these occurrences multiple times within the same agency. Those kind of situations are easily identified at the federal level, and it could give them a tremendous basis and onus for saying, hey, the states can't handle their data. We need to federalize more and more. So sorry for that little sidebar, but I thought it would be important to give you guys a little bit of a view of what some of the federal agencies, how they think and how they are impacted by the data that we have. So let me continue. We've finished business metadata and its importance. Let's look at technical metadata. And again, just as a reminder, technical metadata helps our IT department better manage, maintain, and grow our IT system. So let's look at it. So before we get into fully technical metadata, I want to first describe what our systems look like. The next slide is actually pulled from an organization we work with. Huge organization, Fortune 14 at the time. This is one process. This is what customer looks like for this organization. As you could see, it would be impossible to understand all of the places where customer goes within an organization of this size. Now, some of you out there are saying, well, wait a minute. You took something very obvious, like customer. You picked a Fortune 100 company, in this case, Fortune number 14. Maybe our systems are not this bad. Okay, well, let's take more of a physical look of what our IT systems look like. And I'm going to suggest that the systems we build today look a little bit like this. I would challenge anybody in our group today to try to walk us through this system flow chart. And this is a small organization, much smaller than any of the state agencies we have on this call. They're not a large organization. And in this, there are multiple problems that we have when we have this type of architecture. And I'm saying that this is typical within our organizations. In fact, state architecture tends to be even more convoluted. What does this kind of architecture create? Number one, redundancy. Lots of data redundancy, lots of process redundancy, tremendous amounts of technical redundancy. It's all a big issue for us. Number two, if we change something on the left of our screens, one of our source systems, we have no idea what downstream applications and systems and programs will be impacted. And that happens to us all the time in the government space. We'll change a system, modify a field, and we will break 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 different downstream applications because we had no idea all this was tied together. When I show this slide or speak to this live to a group, I like to ask people to raise their hands if this looks like your agency's architecture. And typically, almost every hand goes up. This is typical. This kind of architecture, or lack of architecture, I should say, permeates our states. We had the pleasure as a company to re-engineer this. So I can give you some real-life statistics behind this. When you look at the chart, they have 8 independent data marts. These are all different end-user reporting systems, 8 independent data marts. When we go through them and remove all the duplication, all the redundancy, we ended up with 2. Really almost could have done it all in one if it wasn't for the actuarial department. We found 7-fold needless data redundancy, meaning, let's say they had 700 terabytes in here. We could have done all of the reporting, all of the backups, everything we needed with 100 terabytes, literally 1/7. Because what we found is all these applications had the same data. They just looked at it a little differently. One group looked at, let's say, taxpayer types 1, 2, 3, 4, and another group looks at taxpayer types 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That is not a reason to make duplicate data. And sadly, this image would be an oversimplification of really any state agency I've ever seen. We duplicate data more in the government side than most U.S. companies, even though U.S. companies can be very skilled at making meaningless duplicate systems. But boy, this is something we struggle with, and sadly, this is reality for most of us. So looking at this, technical metadata targets this kind, oh my gosh, I can't believe I left that slide without bringing up the most important problem. How dare I? The biggest problem with this kind of architecture is it's wildly expensive to maintain, incredibly costly, and it prevents us from ever getting rid of some of these old systems. I could share with you one of the large federal agencies we worked with had a system that had a particular acronym, and in the acronym it had the letter A. That A stood for Axes, A-X-I-S. Now, for some of you World War II historians out there, you will know that Axes was a term used to identify the German, Japanese, Italian group that we battled in World War II. This system was built in the early 50s and is still being used to this day. I mean, it's just shocking. A system like that, we have to be able to roll off of that. So this type of redundancy, these type of problems impact our bottom line. They make our budgets bloated, wildly bloated, and incredibly difficult to provide value. And that is an area that in the federal level, if you look at what's happening, so we have a lot of people we work with up there to this day, and this is starting to flow, I would imagine, into our state agencies. And I'd be curious to hear what you guys are experiencing. But the states we work with, they are hearing from the federal sector, you need to be more efficient, you need to streamline. That's what we're hearing. And I would imagine you guys are hearing it too. So this is a clear example of where we can streamline. And technical metadata management targets it. It looks to identify the redundancies within our applications and remove them. It looks to reduce rework, reduce research time, limit redundant processes, limit redundant data, and really dramatically reduce the probability of project failure. How does it do this? Well, from a technical perspective, technical metadata, it does it through something called an impact analysis. So let me explain what that is. A technical impact analysis is a metadata-driven report that helps us assess the impact of a change on our IT system. So it has data heritage and data lineage. So I realize I just gave several different concepts out there. Let me explain each. When we talk about data heritage, we mean where did the data originate? When did it first come into our sphere of control? Data heritage. Data lineage. It's everything that has happened to the data while it was in our applications, whether it entered through a state agent, administrator typing in an application for a license, a driver's license. That would be the heritage, where it first comes in our systems. And that license number goes through, let's say, 4, 5, 6, 7 different systems. Maybe some things are added to it. Maybe some things are changed with its total record. All that is data lineage, everything that's happened to the data. And what a technical impact analysis does is it takes a proposed change to our IT systems and shows us the impact that change could have. So here's an example. And this is a classic, very simple example we deal with. Let's suppose we needed to change the cust table of our order entry system. We just need to make a change to that. Basic question is, what are the downstream impacts to a change to that table? And we'd see that, we would impact, here are the programs that use that table, the downstream tables and files, table type, and also the fields. How valuable would this be? Because how do we get this information today? Well, we get it by calling our smart people, the ones who work with these systems all the time, and say, if we were to expand a state resident name, how would that impact? Let's say today it's 30 characters. We want to make it 40. It would take an army of people analyzing and studying our systems to come up with that. We're good metadata management. When we build these correctly, it allows us to run reports based on that metadata to see where we have that information throughout all of our systems. Let me continue. Here's another example. This is actually very much like the one I shared, where we're taking customer name and expanding it. So I'll just keep moving. Okay, what about metadata management for systems consolidation? This is a classic problem that we deal with. As we know, in our state agencies, what we've done is we've built a lot of duplicate systems. So we need to start removing these duplicate systems. Wouldn't it be great if we could run a report that would show, here are, and this is an example of a company purchasing another one, where we have Big City Bank purchasing Small Town Bank. And what Big City Bank has is all of their critical data elements: customer number, customer type, customer card indicator, all these different things. They have a good definition that comes right from their data governance process. And then from the systems that they are integrating, they can see, cust name, C-U-S-T-N-U-M, this first line in white, on the right side, is the same as our cust num, because this is how we integrate our systems. We need to look and say, in this particular system, we see how these fields match the system that we want to keep so that we can brown out the others. We did exactly this. We had a big project with the Navy, and they had 4 different systems that we knew did the same thing. And it was a big mapping exercise to go in, build the metadata connections to say, oh, these fields in this system match the fields of the one we're migrating to. And that's really what this example shows. And I think the next slide just gives a more detailed view of these transformation rules. And when I share this, some of you are saying, my goodness, if we were to capture all that and put it in our metadata, managed metadata environment, that seems like a lot of work. Well, yeah, it is a lot of work. But here's the key concept to understand. If we're going to ever roll off these duplicate systems, don't we have to do this analysis? Yeah, absolutely we do. So there is no choice but to do this analysis. The only choice we're making is, do we put this in our managed metadata environment so we can reuse all of this information? Basically, everything in the left side of our screen, we can reuse that for our next project, and our next one? Or do we put it on cocktail napkins, Word documents, and most likely Excel spreadsheets, which just litter our agencies? That's the key question, because when they're in the Word docs and spreadsheets and cocktail napkins and SharePoint, they're not reusable. So key concepts. So what is the cost of redundancy? I'm going to go through this quickly because we have so much I still need to cover. When you look at redundancy, here's an example from the commercial world. Large healthcare company, most of you would know who they are, healthcare insurance. They have a $1.6 billion IT budget, just gigantic. They estimate that it costs them $2 a month to store each gigabyte of data. That number of $2 a month escalates to $8 a month if you add in services to people cost and maintenance. They estimate that they have 1.6 petabytes of redundant data. So the question is, how much does this cost them yearly? Well, simple math. $153 million. Oh, and then 600,000 more. We see this number and we think, wow, that is a big number. It would be great to get rid of that kind of redundancy. But what I would challenge you is to think about this, is there's a number above and beyond this 153 million. It's a bigger number, bigger, but it's harder to measure. And that is that people are using this redundant data. And that's a challenge we have in our state agencies. All these different satellite applications and different analytical engines that people have built that we may not even know about, they're actually using to make decisions. And as a result, it's negatively impacting our state agencies. That number of what that costs us is much harder to define, but it's very significant. So let's continue. When we look at building a managed metadata environment, being able to manage our metadata globally within our agency, it's critical because it is a system that helps us actually manage our internal systems. So with that, let's kind of transition. I've tried to hit you guys with some basic metadata management fundamentals so that we had a good, solid foundation. Let's move forward and look at some basic concepts of metadata management in the larger data management picture. So let's take a look at that. Data management. Metadata management is directly tied to the larger data management topic. And Eric had mentioned earlier the use of DAMA's DMBOK, their body of knowledge. That, we were fortunate. We had, I think, 7 or 8 people within our organization who helped contribute to that. I think Dr. Anne-Marie Smith has been speaking with you, to you guys in some past sessions, and she was one of the authors of that. And it really is a wonderful approach because it gives, in one simple view, what data management entails. Because data management is the systematic processes and governance procedures for applications, our processes, our data, and our technology at a holistic enterprise perspective. And the key things here is we're going to do it systematically, we're going to do it holistically, and we need to do it at an enterprise perspective. So even with a state agency, that is still an enterprise, and we need to manage it as such. So let's take a look, let's kind of continue on this concept, because the purpose of data management is to bring enterprise order, purpose, structure, and efficiency and performance to our applications, our processes, our data, and our metadata. That's why we do it, because data does not manage itself. When we look at data management, and out of everything on this slide, I really want everyone to remember the fourth bullet. Data management is not a single technology or component, but a coordinated framework of disciplines for managing our data, our metadata, and our information assets, because data doesn't manage itself. You know, it's interesting, we go to these vendor shows, and you'll talk to the latest, software craze, or read about the latest software craze, and they make it sound like, oh yeah, we do data management, just buy our software and it'll manage all the data for you. That's not true. That is absolutely inaccurate, because data management, it's not a single piece of technology or some component. It's a coordinated framework of disciplines. Some of those disciplines, and you'll see them all on the DMBOK wheel, data governance and metadata management, to me are seminal, because data does not manage itself. If we don't address these challenges, the problems in our agencies will only get worse. They will not get better. I can name you one organization I'm thinking of off the top of my head. Their problems are so severe, the redundancy so ingrained, it would cost them over $1 billion just to streamline what they have. It would be just a massive expenditure, because the problem is just that severe. So let's continue. So, hey, you guys have lasted 43 minutes on this call, and you're saying, well, wait a minute, we're a state government. Why should we care about metadata management? Well, that's a darn good question. So let's look at it. Number one, a lot of you guys are moving to Agile software development. And one of the key tenets of Agile is quicker, faster, hopefully better. That's what we want. We want it better also. Well, how are you going to be able to agilely build your applications if you don't know the who, what, when, where, how, and why of your data? Well, the truth is you're not going to be able to do that. You're going to be sitting in those Agile meetings. You're going to be doing your latest 2-week sprint in your Agile environment, and you won't even know what data you're supposed to be pulling in. Or worse yet, you'll make a snap decision on the data, and that will really lead to problems, possibly even punitive problems at the federal level or with some other outside agency. So it is just beyond critical if we're going to do Agile development. Number two, multi-sourcing. This is a giant challenge that we are dealing with within our states. I could tell you at the federal level, it's astounding how some of these contracts work. We were on one contract. There was literally 4 or 5 different vendors who owned the contract before it got to us, the group who was actually doing the work. It literally went through 4 different organizations before it got to us. Now, we're the ones doing the work. So, I mean, none of these other groups are really doing anything except shuffling paper. So this is a challenge. And when we're dealing with multiple vendors working on sometimes the same effort, this gets very complicated, because you may not even fully realize what company is doing the work at the end of the line, especially with some of the requirements we have for small businesses, minority or special group-owned businesses. We want to be able to identify them, because that's something that's critical. And making sure all of these vendors have access to our metadata, it's critical to us. because we need these project components to actually work together. If we have one group working on component A and another group working on component B, they better know how those components are being built. They better have a common metadata store. If they don't, it's highly unlikely these components will fit together. I could think of several examples where multi-sourcing created this problem. One company is building a square widget, the other company is building a round widget, and they are not going to fit together. And I'm sure any of you who've been working on these kind of applications understand this problem. So let's continue. Why should we care about metadata management? Oh, I'm sorry, did I hear something?
And David, I'd like to interject a question here.
Yeah.
On this slide, please. Something you and I've talked about, Anne Marie and I have talked about this. Dr. Orgeron, CIO for Mississippi, and Patrick Moore, former CIO for Georgia, now with Integris, we have talked about this idea that the data that you have and the quality of that data is inherited by the analytics that you're using to analyze it.
Yep.
Then the decisions you're making inherits the quality of the analytics. And then, of course, the policy decisions, the policy impacts on citizens, is inheriting all of that. So the criticality of data and the quality of the data and the importance of metadata play a role there. But could you speak to that a little bit, please?
Eric, I love the term you used, inheritance. When we come in and try to help an organization improve their data management, you always start by how do we improve our data? Because if our data is flawed, if it's wrong, it doesn't matter what we do downstream, because any of those analytics applications will inherit the problems in our data. In addition, you mentioned the policies. We're going to build policies based on the data that we're looking at, which is flawed. In our analytics engine, it inherits, all those policies inherit the problems within that data. And I'll share with you a common problem that exists probably in 80 to 90% of state agencies. It's the problem of second and third level data warehouses. This is where we need to build an analytical engine, and instead of sourcing it from our systems or having one version of the truth, we pull data from multiple sources, including other data warehouses. We call this a level 2 data warehouse, where a data warehouse is pulling from another data warehouse. It's not a data mart because it has other sources too, but it's a level 2. When we build these, that data warehouse inherits all of the problems, all of the issues of the warehouse it's sourcing, plus all of the constraints of that level 2 warehouse are inherited back to the first level warehouse. It's a huge problem you bring up, and it's seminal. It hits all of us. All right, let me continue. Great question, Eric. I really enjoy that one on the inheritance of the challenges, because we need to fix this at its source. All right, let me continue. Cross-jurisdictional collaboration. So this is a massive area. States are starting to work together more and more. And this, again, is being pushed from a federal level in many cases. When we do that, it is vital that we can communicate our data and what it means to these other states. If not, if we have to do it the old way, which is just manual meetings, one-offs, it burns a tremendous amount of time, because we don't really have the capability to communicate all that we have to do. I mean, it would be hundreds of meetings and phone calls. As a result, it tends not to get done. I know at the federal side, sometimes we just say, oh, let's slap out some, something in ISO 11179 format, and everybody will share that. Everybody's interacting with that standard in a different manner. So the data does not equal across all those different agencies. So cross-jurisdictional collaboration necessitates that we manage our metadata better so that we know what does our data mean when we look at it. I see somebody, oh gosh, is this John Rager? You bring up a phenomenal point about highly sensitive data. My goodness, do we have some sensitive data out there? Things like CTI, which is controlled technical information. What about PHI, protected health information? PII, personal identifiable information. There are very strong legislation that is required for each of those different elements, each of those different types of key data classifications. And we need to understand those, and we need to be able to adhere to them. Because guess what? We're now going to be sharing this data, and that puts all of us under exposure. And that's something we want to avoid. So what a great point, John. Let me continue. You mentioned developing a metadata. Dr. Anne-Marie Smith here, given the hard questions, the major components. All right, I'll get into the major components of a metadata strategy. I'll wrap up this last point on federal requirements and then go to that. Federal requirements and oversight continue to encroach and place demands on us. We need to manage our data properly because the requirements we're getting from the federal level, let's be honest about it. They're constantly changing. Sometimes they're a little bit obfuscated. It's sometimes hard to meet a requirement that is vague. But unfortunately, that's our job. And there are penalties many times associated with noncompliance. So that is something that we need to be able to manage actively, or we're going to have some big problems. Let me get into Anne-Marie's question on developing a metadata strategy, and I'll go over it quickly. When you look at developing a metadata strategy, the first thing you need to do is conduct an assessment of what your environment looks like. We need to look at, hey, what are we doing well and what are we not doing well? And I believe you guys had a talk on a data management framework, capability maturity model. I think that was one of the earlier talks that you guys had received.
Yes, and we did that with Dr. Peter Aiken, and yeah, that is also recorded on our website.
Wonderful. Yeah, you want to look at your environment and then say, okay, here's where we're at today. How do we get to that next level of metadata management? And to me, there's a couple fundamentals that you have to look at. A good metadata management strategy will look to target both business metadata and technical metadata. It's going to target our critical data elements, the ones we use throughout our organization, not just in one little area. And again, guys, if you look at the data we have, we cannot manage all of it. That's just not realistic. But there will be a set of our data, that 20%, that we use 80% of the time, the famous 80-20 rule. Target that. Target your core systems, because I assure you, those are the ones we're going to be going after over and over again. So let me kind of take this forward. When you look at data management for a state, there are two key foundational elements. Metadata management, which is our technical enablement for data management, and then data governance, that middle of the DM Bach wheel. Again, data governance is the people processes, how we make decisions. Metadata management is the technical enabler for both data governance and overall data management, because again, it's defining the basics. So whether we are doing master data management, information delivery, security, information quality, process management, whatever it is, metadata management and data governance are vital to accomplishing that. So, and there we see data governance right in the center of the DM Bach wheel. So let me just kind of hit a couple more points, and then we'll wrap it up with some questions. a lot of times we want to manage our data better. And one of the key things is we cannot manage anything we do not measure. And by the way, we cannot measure anything we don't understand. And guess what? If we don't understand it, we're in deep, deep trouble. So I share this not to have kind of a trite kind of like cliche, but to communicate a couple key points. If we want to manage our information assets, number one, we need to understand what assets we have, the basics, the who, what, when, where, how, and why. The second thing, we need to measure. I wish I could draw on this slide. I would circle measure. We need to take a baseline. Do we even know within our agency how many applications we have? As I ask that question, most everyone on this call is saying, I don't have any idea how many applications we have. Exactly. We need to measure. We need to figure out the scope of what we have. Our data, how many applications, the basics. If we have a data quality problem that we're trying to address, let's measure those things, because then we can start actively managing it and improve it, because that's the goal. Because all of this is metadata management. So let me kind of wrap it up, and then we'll open up the floor for more questions. Metadata management is foundational to all the things that we're doing, whether it's, again, the who, what, when, where, how, and why. It's critical for data security and compliance. How are we going to have good security on things like, our FTI, which is federal tax information, or protected health information? We need to first understand, well, what is protected health information? There are parameters around that, and we need to adhere to that. And then where do we have PHI within our applications? How are we going to do machine learning and AI, which, let's be honest, how many of our states are really utilizing machine learning and AI? But maybe we would like to. Those machine learning and AI applications, all the ones you hear about in a TED Talk of something that actually doesn't even exist, most of those applications, ones that do work, the ones that are successful have excellent data management behind them. It's critical. Data governance we've talked about, master data management, absolutely important. How would we ever be able to define our master data management fields, our golden records, if we don't even know the basics of our data? And to Eric's question about inheritance, advanced analytics, predictive analytics, prescriptive, all the 6 different types. How about cognitive analytics, all these fantastic terms we read about? They are only as good as the data we are giving them. If that data is flawed, forget about it. Nothing's going to work. So with that, I'm going to open up the floor for questions. And Eric, do you want to, I don't know if you come in, or I'm ready to take any questions we got.
Let me start this out, but Danielle has informed everyone, use the chat for questions. So we're going to be looking for that.
Awesome.
Question coming from the audience. But let me ask you this. We just published a report this year as part of our data classification series. It's titled Better Data Security Through Classification, a Game Plan for Smart Cybersecurity Investments. And it's this, along this frame of mind, is you need to understand your data and your level of confidence to know what are you going to invest in protecting it. There's that aspect, David, and then there's this aspect, as we talked about the inheritance issue. Can we, as part of the metadata, is this something that's being done now or should we be considering for future, is actually assigning a level of confidence to in the metadata, and thus guide users on what data to use when they're making decisions. In other words, you might have data out there and sort of the internal marketplace decides what data is actually going to rise to the surface, because you might say if you use this data, we have this level of confidence in terms of its accuracy and how up to date it is. Has that concept been something that you have encountered or introduced anywhere in your consultancy?
Absolutely. It's something we've actually been doing that for almost 20 years. Not every, I will say that is something when an organization matures a little bit more, then you can get into those levels of confidence. Typically what we've done, and I showed it on an earlier report where I showed the number of records that were not loaded, and I showed the dollar values not loaded. A lot of times we'll begin with those just kind of basic measurable items, and then we try to evolve and mature the client partner to where they can actually have those classifications. And what we're seeing, and you brought up, some of the issues that we have of things like, PHI and some of these PII, the personal identifiable information. Some organizations are actually classifying that at a data level, and it's not just individual data elements, Eric. It's sometimes what we call a data package, where the individual data element may not be PII, but when we merge it with other data elements, then it becomes PII. So having those classifications, both at a data element perspective, but also at the package perspective, then you can really have a solid ranking of that data and that confidence indicator so that we know what we're using is good or not as good as it could be.
Right, and it's probably going to encounter the criticality of the decision and the impact in terms of policy outcomes for citizens. And the other thing that, we've talked about in past is, can you really, in order to properly do cybersecurity, you have got to be able to understand the value of your data. And so I'm going to propose to you, see if you agree, I don't think we can adequately address cybersecurity without proper metadata management. Do you agree with that statement?
100%. Look at a company like Equifax, who's supposed to know better, right? And they had this huge data breach. It's because of their lack of metadata management. They have neglected that part. And that was actually, you won't read this in the headlines, but for those of us who know a little bit about that organization, that's actually one of the foundational components they didn't have. So it is, when we look at cybersecurity, this matter, metadata management is foundational in that. And it's only going to get worse, Eric, because these data breaches are not going to stop until we manage our data better.
Very good. David, I don't see any more questions coming through, but it doesn't mean people can't ask questions after the webinar. There is David's contact information. Please feel free to contact David directly. We've done the same thing with Dr. Anne-Marie Smith, Dr. Peter Aiken. Anyone we bring on to these webinars, we're providing, and they've been graciously kind to provide their contact information. But go ahead and present any of your questions directly to David or to me, and we will get those answers for you. But I want to thank you, David, for coming here and presenting to us, and we're looking forward to having you back. And also everyone who participated this afternoon, we will record, this is recorded, we will put the recording on our website along with the slides. So thank you all for being here. Thank you, Danielle, for taking care of us on the technical side. And we look forward to seeing you on the next webinar. Have a good afternoon.